we're here to talk about this book specifically and kind of the Occupy movement generally. And Kate and I are two of the three editors, together with Margaret Killjoy. And both Kate and I are going to talk a little bit about why we got involved in this book project. So since I'm talking now, I'll start. But you know, we probably, it was probably like December or so that we started talking about this book. December, January, and Kate approached me and said, "You want to work on this book that AK is looking to put out?" And part of my motivation during the first couple months of Occupy, you know, one of the things that was inspiring about Occupy was how many new people I was meeting. Like in New York, when Occupy Wall Street started off, in the first couple days, it was remarkable how few of the conventional actors that I was used to working with in New York actually showed up for this, and for good reason. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. One of the things that's remarkable was that even the organizers that were working on this, few of whom were folks that I knew, none of them actually showed up on September 17th with sleeping bags or looking to camp out. They all thought that the best aspiration that they could have was doing a general assembly in one of the parks that was targeted for possible occupation. Zuccotti Park was number 2 on the list of 7 possible occupation sites. So that is to say that there were a lot of new people involved, and a lot of these new people, like one of the contributors, Cindy Milstein, talks about these different prehistories to Occupy. And she talks about meeting someone at some anarchist gathering that was giving a presentation on the prehistory of anarchism before Occupy, and she says, "And when do you start?" And he said, "August." And she's like, "August of what year?" And she said, 2011. So this guy started the prehistory a month before Occupy. And one of the things that was interesting in the conversations I was having with a lot of these new folks is that they were judging the Occupy experience based on 1 or 2 months and very new activity, and everybody from the outside, and this actually influences what we're talking about today, I think. You know, we're a year out. October 4th is the anniversary for Occupy Baltimore. September 17th was the anniversary for Occupy Wall Street in New York. So we're a year out from all this stuff, and a lot of folks are writing the Occupy movement off. And Francis Fox, let's just say, part of these conversations that I was having was trying to help folks that were new to social movements understand that this is a much longer trajectory. And when Kate invited me to work on this book, I was like, you know, this would be a really good way to participate and to give another tool for folks to understand that this is part of a process that's a much longer trajectory. And to get people other than me, people that are much smarter, much better respected than me to say stuff that I wanted to say. And we're not the only ones doing it. Here, I've got 2 books of folks doing similar things. This is actually, one of our contributors is Frances Fox Piven, and I was soliciting a piece from her, wanting her to talk a little bit more about the prehistory. She's famous for a book called Poor People's Movements. And I wanted her to do like this little 10-page summary of poor people's movements and kind of lessons to be learned for the Occupy movement. Her book here, this is a pamphlet put out by Haymarket Books, is Lessons for Our Struggle. And after pressuring her a lot to contribute, she sends me something called, Is Occupy Over? And I was like, oh man, come on, okay. So to jump to the conclusion a little bit, she says, I think not. The notion that Occupy is over is too much influenced by the misleading metaphors that we rely on to describe social movements. When movement actions attract public attention, we refer to the events as explosions. And we say these explosions are lit by sparks. But movements are, in fact, complex. They have deep and tangled causes eluded by the spark and explosion metaphor. They include organized and spontaneous elements, and their life trajectory generally unfolds in a moment, not in a moment, but over several decades. Then she goes on to detail things marking the labor movement, the abolitionist movement, which has its first act as early as 1774, then emancipation happening in 1863, so 90 years later, 89 years later. So she goes through that history, and the book is actually, I was thinking about reading a bunch of selections from 3 different authors, but as I was flipping through today, there are so many good pieces in here. One of our contributors, Cindy Milstein, just blogged about the book, and she's seeing it for the first time other than her piece. And she's like, you know, there's so many good things in here, and I keep on just cutting out these chapters and carrying them with me throughout my day and reading them. But I'm going to stop talking, introduce the contributors that we do have here. We're going to go in the following order: Ryan Harvey, Lester Spence, John Duda, Nadine Block, and Kate Khatib. One more thing that I want to add as I'm introducing these folks is that from the beginning, we didn't want this to be a commentary on the Occupy movement. The subtitle we established before we had any text for the book, so the subtitle is a little bit misleading. It has more to do with our aspirations than the result. So it's Reflections on Movement Strategy from Occupation to Liberation. A more apt subtitle, if we were to write it now, would probably be more like Observations from Within the Occupy Movement. But all the folks that are contributing are movement actors. Some more involved than others. Some are central organizers to the different occupations. Some are folks that were more peripheral. Some are folks like Francis Fox Piven that would go down to Occupy Wall Street, but is a point of reference for many people. All of these contributors I know not through intellectual production, but through movements that we worked on together. Ryan, who is going to lead us off, I met in 2001 after September 11th when we were working on peace stuff, meeting at the Quaker Center up on York Road. And Ryan showed up, and for all of his existence, he's been a massive flyerer. He's a propagandist for the movement through song and through flyering. Lester, who follows him, I met on a conference call in 2004, and when we were plotting on the No Stolen Elections campaign, we were trying to, as Republicans, get more and more clever on how to steal elections, as demonstrated strongest in the 2000 election. We were preparing in 2004 for direct action resistance to the possibility of electoral theft and fraud. And I hear this guy who introduces himself in Baltimore, and I'm like, who the hell is this dude on a national conference call in Baltimore that I've never met before? So we met each other, and our collaboration has grown through Occupy Baltimore and a piece that we co-wrote together in this book. John, I met doing the build-out for Red Emmas, and he's been a stalwart. He and Kate together, I met in that process, and they've both been holding down kind of infrastructural leftist activity as well as intellectual production in Baltimore for all this time. Nadine, who's been contributing to Occupy movements along the eastern seaboard. I think I met for the first time when she was facilitating a meeting for an IMF World Bank demonstration in 2000. So all these folks I met through the movement. I don't know all of the contributors, and I don't agree with all the contributors. But it's important for us that all of these contributors that are in the book are commenting from within the Occupy movement and doing their analysis and doing their growth, doing their observations as part of this longer trajectory for the movement. So with that, Ryan Harvey.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me all right on this? Yeah? All right. So, hey, I'm Ryan. I'm from Baltimore, and I just got back 2 days ago from like a 2.5-month trip through Europe, through Egypt, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to be giving a more in-depth talk about it next week at some point at Red Emma's. You have to look on their website. We're still trying to figure out the day. I'm going to be speaking kind of as I wasn't centrally involved in the Occupy movement really in any way compared to what I would like to have said I was. But then again, being involved in the Occupy movement was a pretty interesting thing. How many people here would consider themselves having been involved in the Occupy movement? Right? That could mean you went to one assembly. It could mean you went to one rally. Right? Because the Occupy movement was and continues to be I don't want to say vague in a bad way, but maybe vague in a good way, right? There's many, many, many ways to participate. And so in that sense, yeah, I'm totally part of the Occupy movement, right? But I wasn't organizing meetings and all this stuff. But I did travel around to a lot of the Occupy sites, both here and in Europe, in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, in Ireland, and various places. So in my piece for the book, kind of talks about the history of my history of where Occupy came from. But I'm going to talk, you can read about that in the book, so I'm going to talk about something different right now. But one of the things that a lot of us have struggled with since the Occupy movement started is what to do with it, what to do with this momentum. There was clearly a ton of momentum. And the conversation now is the momentum gone? Is the Occupy movement over? What was it? Was it a movement? Was it a social experience? Was it just an outpour of emotion and whatnot? And when we're having these conversations, I've encountered a tendency for people to say, oh man, in Egypt they do this, in Spain they do this, and we just do this. And part of my trip was investigating that. Is it true? Does Egypt have it together and the US doesn't? Is Spain on the cutting edge of revolutionary mass politics? And the answer is no. They're all dealing with like the exact same conversations, varying levels, you know? Obviously, 900 people weren't killed in the US in the Occupy movement like were killed in the Egyptian revolution. But there's a ton of young people, mostly young people in Egypt right now, going, okay, what do we do now? Was that even a revolution? What was it? Now the Egyptian government's taking a $5 billion loan out from the International Monetary Fund, which is who the European social movements are struggling against. So people are asking themselves these same kind of questions. In Spain, the same issues. You go to Spain right now, and you know, obviously there was these big protests in Madrid just the other day. When I was in Spain a week before those protests, I didn't meet anyone who was like, yeah, the 25th, there's going to be a big protest. They were like, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. So it's like the same spirit, you know, which partly shows a pitfall, a complication of this kind of spontaneous mass organizing. Like, yeah, you don't necessarily ever know. There's a lot of confusion about it. But at the same time, it's like, I was in Portugal 2 weeks ago. They had the largest demonstration since they overthrew fascism in 1974. And it was against the IMF, and it was against austerity measures. It was organized by a couple people on Facebook. It wasn't organized by unions, it wasn't organized by the political parties. It was organized by some people on Facebook. And it's an organizational complication, you know? But the spirit is out there, the desire is out there. And I think a lot of what is happening in the world right now, specifically in these hot spots, and the US is one of those hot spots, is like we're trying to get beyond some of these old ways of doing politics, and we don't know how to, not on a mass level. We don't know how to envision what non-bureaucratic trade unions look like. In Europe, they don't know how to envision what the left looks like because it was leftists that signed agreements with the IMF in Greece, in Spain, and so now Spain had an election, they have a right-wing government. Greece has the fastest growing and most right-wing fascist neo-Nazi party in all of Europe, right? Because of the economic crisis, because they're coming out and they're, quote, offering solutions for poor people to the economic crisis. And they're gaining a lot of momentum. Kind of how the Tea Party gained a lot of momentum doing similar rhetoric in 2008 and 2009. Like in places like in Egypt, right, it was really violent, right? They burned down every police station in Cairo. They burned down Mubarak's party's headquarters. They killed a bunch of cops, right? Like it was not a non-violent revolution. In Spain, the Indignados movement was really pacifistic, right? Both of them are dealing with the same issues. And so you see, oh, maybe it's not an issue of is violence or non-violence as some great moral question. It's an issue of strategy, organizing, and like revolt, when and where. I'm trying to condense so much. And so, I guess like the thing that I was really getting at in my chapter in the book, and in my conversations with people, is like the question of where to go from here. And I don't think it's a question that we need to be like killing ourselves over and beating ourselves on the head for. Like, social change is a long-term process. It's not an overnight process. It shouldn't be an overnight process. And if you go to Egypt right now, you'll see that. You'll see, oh, like revolutions that happen in a short period of time aren't complete revolutions because society doesn't completely change in that time period. That takes longer. And so I don't think it's a problem to step back and say, okay, last year was crazy, amazing, complicated, and all of these things. There's a lot of problems with it. There's a lot of benefits to it, a lot to figure out. We don't need to be in a rush because if we rush too much, we're going to mess it up. The last point I wanted to touch on is these freaking signs that say Occupy the Vote that I've been seeing around Baltimore. Go to Egypt right now and tell people about occupying the vote, you know? Because they rushed to have this election and now they're getting screwed over by the government, the revolutionary change that they fought for. Spain, Greece is a good place to go talk about occupying the vote, where the fascists are winning more and more and more votes in the election. go out and vote if you want to. But social change, the vote is not where the fight is. I'm not telling you not to vote or to vote, but like the fight is not there. The fight is out where it was last year publicly. That's when they started to freak out, remember? You know? Like, they're not sending riot police to polling stations to stop you from voting because they're not that worried about it. You know? And I'll be here afterwards and gladly talk to anybody about any of the, if you have any questions about stuff I said.
Folks, real quick, John, these mics are not picking up real well, so if you're not a great projector, you might want to just go up to that mic. Yeah. It seems to be picking up a little better, because I know there's a lot of background noise, so just...
You guys know I kind of talk loud. The mic's not going to be a problem with me. And when I told both of them, I said, listen, this band is next to us, so what I'm going to need you guys to do is like a really big request. I'm going to need you to kind of bring it. So in fact, do I need to move this back? What do I need to do with it? I'm not doing anything. All right, so here's the deal. Joel Olson is a political scientist. I'm a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University. Joel Olson is a political scientist, a punk, and a radical activist, or he was. And he wrote a piece. He wrote a piece on Occupy to kind of get us to think about Occupy's racial politics. Now, I bring him up not just because I wrote a response, or Mike and I wrote a response to him, but because he passed away earlier this year. He had given a talk at Hopkins right outside my office, but I figured because we were planning to meet one another Labor Day weekend at another conference that I'd skip out. I'd had conversations with him. I never met him personally. I had a chance. Next thing I know, he was gone. So I wrote this response, or we wrote this response, not just to wrestle with what we think are the more unpacked, not just to wrestle with racial politics more in a more broader fashion than what he did, but also to give him honor. For those of you, I don't see any card-carrying political scientists necessarily in the audience, but political scientists in general look and have the politics that you imagine they look and have the politics. They don't in general look like me. They don't in general roll like me. They don't in general have our politics. So Joel Olson was like a beacon in the night, so we wanted to give him kind of his props. So what was his argument? And what I'm going to try to do is give you his argument quickly and then talk about how we talked about it. His argument was basically that if you look at agenda setting is a form of power by which the agenda itself, how you set the agenda, how you talk about issues on the agenda itself is a form of power, and if you use it the wrong way, can oppress people. And he was talking about Occupy at its nascent stages, that there was a way in which voices of people of color were routinely dismissed. Oh, that's not a real issue. That's a very specific issue, right? So one of the terms that Occupy used that was really effective was the idea of we're the 99%, right? That we represent everybody except this thin slice. Now, there are a whole range of different people within that everybody. If you look at income, if you look at education, if you look at class, if you look at gender, if you look at sexuality, if you look at region, there are a whole bunch of slices in there. And what Joe was arguing was that if you make this broad argument that student debt is the issue and this black stuff doesn't matter, right? This racial brutality stuff doesn't matter, then what you're in effect doing is oppressing not just a part of the 99%, but a part that real talk has been dealing with these issues for a real long time, right? So way before middle-class white populations have been dealing with debt, black populations, Latino populations have been dealing with debt, right? And that's where he located the racial politics of Occupy. It was a broadside. It wasn't supposed to be deeply theoretical. It was just a broadside. And he wrote, and once he made that argument, he was like, listen, in response to this, we should do this. So where Mike and I stepped in is we wanted to actually talk about that the racial politics a bit broader, not just to say where it was, but also places where you see some pushback. Because I think Baltimore is one of those sites where you actually see pushback. To be fair, you don't see it in this audience right now. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I count every time. There are only like 6 of us in here, right? But Baltimore, you see some pushback. 7, I got you. I got you on the back. You're not counting me. You're not counting me. 8, yeah, 8. My fault. Yeah, I got you, brother. I got you. What? Yeah. So real quickly, if you think about Occupy, one of the first places we can look at power and racial politics is in the very occupation, right? Not just the language of occupation. So not long after Occupy Baltimore was created, Liberate Baltimore was created, right? Because the whole idea of Occupy means something different in general to non-white Americans than it does to other populations. But it's also about site location. To a certain extent that happened in Baltimore, but it happened in a number of other sites. The places where Occupy took place already had people on them. They were homeless in some cases. Damn, my 5 minutes are up. I would, okay. They were homeless in some cases. In some cases, you're talking about people who were addicted, and they were using those sites to consume drugs, right? As soon as those places were taken over, rules were established where the people who were already there weren't able to actually be who they were, right? So that's one site, occupation and displacement. The other place is in agenda setting, not just the way that my colleague Joel talked about it, but also once you actually see power deployed, once you see Occupy become legitimate, there were all types of funding sources that were giving Occupy money that weren't giving people who had been organizing around these issues money, many of them people of color, right? And they actually, people who have been fighting these issues a long time, people had to make a choice because Occupy was viewed as legitimate, because the whites who were involved in Occupy were already connected to these networks. Blacks and other non-white Americans weren't involved. I'm going to talk about the third one in the question and answer, but what I'd like to do is talk about pushback. One of the things that's really unique about Baltimore is that once McKeldin Square was no longer an option, there was a really rich discussion about what types of issues people should move on. And the issues that most of us agreed on were Stop the Youth Jail and foreclosure defense. Both of those issues are issues that predominantly affect black populations. And what Occupy Baltimore was able to do, and this process was contentious, politics like this always is they were able to work with black populations in the case of, particularly in the case of Stop Youth Jail, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Baltimore Algebra Project, they were able to come together in a way to actually make substantive change. And in a city like Baltimore, to the extent there's a sweet spot for organizing, I think our challenge here as organizers or people who care about this stuff as politics is to bring together the white left, largely represented by this body, and that body of black and Latino working class youth. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to stand here because it'll help me out. The first thing I want to do is, just as Lester wanted to honor Joel Olson, there's somebody who was involved with Occupy Baltimore really deeply. Many of us were at his memorial earlier this afternoon because he passed just last week. And I want to raise a glass to Paul Poyman, who cooked for Occupy, who was there with Occupy, who was there with a lot of stuff, and he would appreciate a toast. I also want to thank the editors of this book, and I want to thank them specifically for putting together a space where people who were involved with Occupy could reflect. A lot of people were reacting, a lot of people were celebrating, commemorating, criticizing, but putting together a space where people could ask difficult questions about what Occupy was, where it could go, what had happened, what had gone wrong, what had got right, was pretty invaluable. And the question that I asked was, I think in my piece was pretty difficult. It was a difficult one to ask, and I'm really interested to see what kind of responses it gets. Because what I wanted to do was look at where Occupy fit in with the context of anti-capitalist organizing over the past decade. And there was a movement in this country a decade ago called the anti-globalization movement. It was making the same kind of strides into public discourse as Occupy was. It was changing the conversation. It largely went away. It largely collapsed under the weight of repression, under the weight of events that overtook it. And it was interesting to see what happened afterwards. And I'm speaking here from my perspective as somebody who was coming into politics at that time. And what I realized, what a lot of people realized, was that this focus on we need to act in the name of these places where neoliberalism is destroying things outside of the US was a little misguided. And we learned through that movement about all the stuff that was going on here in the US, all the really amazing work that was going on in communities of color, working class communities, people who were really feeling the brunt of a crisis that nobody even knew was yet on the horizon. And people dug in. People were like, I'm not going to fight just for things that are abstract and happening in another hemisphere. I'm going to fight for the things where people are fighting already next door. And as this was going on, those movements were building. They were growing in sophistication. There was all sorts of amazing activism going on in the lead up to Occupy, right? People were occupying houses. People were fighting foreclosures, right? But none of it was really seeming to change the discussion at a national level. And that's the difficult question I wanted to ask in my piece. And I used the figure of the social forum. How many people are familiar with the US Social Forum? That's good, right? You think about it. It happened once in 2007, right when the financial collapse was about to hit, right? Right when, if you were paying attention to what was going on among foreclosures in communities like Baltimore, you knew it was already hitting. You knew that bubble was bursting and it was going to hurt bad, right? The second social forum happens in 2010. After the financial crisis has happened, after the sort of extraordinary bailout measures have taken place, after there's been a recognized crisis of legitimacy on an international scale. And you look at that social forum, which really put together the best of what people were doing in the most intentional, careful, thought out, rigorous, responsible way. And yet it didn't change the conversation, right? It didn't make that connection to that wave that started in Egypt, right? That rolled into Madison. When that Madison stuff happened, the social forum had happened like 6 months beforehand, less than that maybe. And even the social forum organizers admit we had nothing to do with that. We did not connect with that. The networks that we built did not mobilize around that. And this is curious to me, right? Because then you get in September just this remarkable moment where improbably, unexpectedly, without anybody understanding how this could possibly happen, you get this moment of Occupy, where this thing blows up and there's occupations all across the country and it's all everybody can talk about, and all of a sudden politicians are talking about economic inequality and everybody's talking about this crisis of capitalism, and it's a really strange moment. And I think one of the challenges we have is to figure out where to go with that, where to go with that disconnect, where you have organizing that it precisely is built around exactly the questions that Lester was addressing, right? That really, really privileges the voices of the people most affected by the crisis, and that those voices and those structures don't work to do what they need to do, and then you have this totally inadequate response that somehow miraculously manages to change the national conversation. And what I felt was what I tried to get at in my piece is how we need to think not in terms of this kind of like either or perspective on this, where we're like, you know, I don't like what you're doing, therefore I'm not going to participate or support it. I'm just going to stand on the sidelines and criticize it. But what we need to do is think that we need both of these things, right? We need a movement that's capable of digging in for the long haul in a principled, rigorous, responsible fashion that really takes all of these critiques to heart and builds a movement that's really, truly representative. But we also need to be able to take advantage of these opportunities that may not be perfect, that may be messy, that may be inadequate, that may be uncomfortable, and we need to figure out how to move those forward. Because what we've seen is that those movements of chaos, those movements of indeterminacy, those movements that are totally unintelligible, even to the people who are working within them, are some of the movements that actually allow us to sort of move this history forward in a way that's productive. And that's the question I tried to get at, and I think without this book, it would be one that I wouldn't have really gotten into at all. So I will stop there and turn it over to the next person.
I think Lester's just really loud. I don't know if this mic's really better than that mic. Hi, my name's Nadine Block. I live in the People's Republic of Tacoma Park outside of Washington, D.C. And I feel really fortunate to have been cajoled into submitting a piece for this book. And I feel fortunate in a number of ways. As people have mentioned, it's really great to have something written about what you're going through by the people who are actually participating in it. How many people in the audience have been involved with something that you've read that someone else has written about that didn't even step foot anywhere near what you were doing, right? How often is it accurate? How often did it reflect your experience? If it did, you were pretty lucky. So anyway, so that's one thing. So I want to say a big thank you for that. I also feel like I'm probably the oldest person involved with the book. Well, not the oldest person, actually. Some of the people are older. But I'm one of the older people here. And I feel really lucky that I've been involved with a number of movements since, the late 70s, early 80s, when I started my so-called activist career. And the piece that I wrote in the book is about cultural resistance, about creative cultural resistance. And I talk about that because I think that harnessing what people traditionally call the arts, which is everything from painting and sculpture and dance, to cultural work, keeping languages alive, building cultural institutions and things like that. These pieces of cultural work are probably the most effective way at building capacity and the most effective way at challenging the corporate homogenization that says that individuals don't matter and we don't have a prayer in hell of changing the direction we're going. And so that's why I'm involved, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this piece. It's particularly about projections, and there's a great group in Baltimore that does projections. Anybody involved with Green Pants? Yep. All right, excellent. And there's a lot of people using light as a way to throw messages out in the building. In fact, in Egypt, they've done some of the most remarkable projections, something like over a 1 month period, throwing about 500 projections all over the country using the government's and the media's own words to bring light to things that they were trying to suppress. So it's really, really valuable and meaningful to folks there. But I think the one thing that I'll say, and I don't want to talk very long, is that because I've been involved so long, it's really clear to me that there's an ebb and a flow to the work that we do. And when I got involved first in the 80s, anytime we stepped outside or did any kind of political work, people said to us, "Oh man, you're just vaguely reminiscent of the 60s. When are you going to get your shit together? Like, you're just, doing the same old stuff. Like, what is this?" And we'd be like, "Are you kidding? What's the same old stuff about Greenham Common? What's the same old stuff about the nuclear weapons? What's the same old stuff about all the things that we did?" And then, so it was really a relief to me when Seattle happened in 1999 and the World Trade Organization dialogue shifted tremendously. The whole rest of the world had been protesting for 50 years, these neoliberal policies that had destroyed many lives all over the world. But the U.S. finally got with the program, and it was so great because ever since 99, people now say, "Ah, man, you're just remnants of Seattle, blah, blah, blah." And now it's going to be, "Man, you're just leftovers from Occupy." And I'm like, that's growth. That's a bit of change. So I never thought, actually, I would get to that point where I'd say something like this, but I think that history's not circular. It's sort of helical. You move a little bit, if you're lucky, a little further on the path to something better or different. And I see this small language change as really important, and our dialogue has changed. I mean, people really, in the United States in 1999, an average person had no idea what the World Bank was, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Trade Organization, or that there were some white dudes behind a closed door actually dictating how our lives were going to be. And I don't think that was a surprise to anybody who camped out or was involved with Occupy at all. And I think internationally the struggle continues, and it's really interesting. I think my biggest thing, and also related to Seattle, is that we were caught completely off guard in 1999 when the World Trade Organization thing went down. We didn't have the organizers. We didn't have the trainers. People didn't know nothing about nonviolent direct action or how to take space or hold your own power or anything. It was amazing. And having been there, now seeing where we are now, it's one of those of us who are involved. The really big thing that's really important is to stay committed and to stay in the movement to pass on anything that we've learned that might be useful. I'm not saying it would be useful, but it might be useful, and we should actually share it. And people should actually listen and say, hell no, that's not useful anymore. Talking to people directly, screw that. We're just putting out a Facebook invite. Right. So anyways, we all know how far that goes, and both things are useful. I'm not knocking anything off or out of my toolbox. I don't know about the rest of you. So one of those things is really important about building and sustaining capacity. And I think that it's really important to think about that in the sense of even ancient history, like the civil rights struggle. People in this country and all over the world have been working on civil rights issues, and in particular in the US, for 50 to 75 years. Before, and you could probably say 100 years, before the Civil Rights Act got passed. And it wasn't passed simply because people sat in at lunch counters or marched over bridges. There was an international component to this. But, or I should say, and people were ready to take the action to pressure the government at the time when they were particularly vulnerable and felt that they had to show that the United States, President Johnson at the time felt that he had to prove that the United States was a more moral place than the Soviet Union. And that's really why things came up at the moment that they did. How many people know that? Like, I didn't know that until a few years ago, because one of the disservices that people do for activists is say, number one, that you must be born an activist to actually contribute. That's BS, but that's the story of Rosa Parks. One day she was tired and then she didn't get up. No, she had a whole group and a community behind her, and she was trained. And so that systemic repression of the actual power of individuals to work in community is a big problem that we face. And we have to be constantly building up our capacity locally, and locally being somewhat defined by who's ever doing the definition, because local will be different for New York City versus a group in a rural area, what your range is. And we have to listen to people who are actually being impacted and the frontline communities on this, and to keep our collective ability to train each other and teach each other alive so that we can make the changes when the opportunities arrive. And I think cultural work is a big piece of that, and I think I'm really glad that all of you came here tonight to talk with us. Thanks.
So I'm going to come up to the podium because it'll be a little easier for me, maybe. There we go. Thank you. So my name is Kate Khatib. I am with Mike and with Margaret Killjoy, one of the co-editors of this book. I am also one of the collective members at AK Press, which is the collectively owned and operated anarchist publishing house that put this book out. We do have a table in the tent next door, as does Red Emma's, where I'm also a collective member, and I do encourage you to check it out over the course of the weekend. Like John and like Lester, I want to start off by acknowledging two more amazing activists that we lost over the course of the life of Occupy. It's been a rough year. Eric James is a longtime Baltimore organizer who we lost a couple of months ago, and Dara Greenwald, who is a longtime New York City arts activist who we lost at the beginning of this year. And this book is, in a lot of ways, dedicated to them. It's dedicated to Paul. It's dedicated to Joel Olson. It's also dedicated to all the amazing organizers and activists that I see out here today. I'm Baltimore-based. I've lived in Baltimore for the last 10 years. I was a part of Occupy Baltimore. I am still a part of Occupy Baltimore. And I really have learned so much over the course of the last year of organizing with so many of you that I see out here. We didn't really have a chance to think about or talk about putting acknowledgments in this book. And God, how would you acknowledge all of the people that have affected you as an organizer over the course of your life, or even over the course of the last year? But because this is our home city, I want to acknowledge that tonight, and I want to thank all of you who are doing such amazing organizing work. So thank you on behalf of the editors, and thank you on behalf of me. I also want to start by reading the first paragraph of the introduction to this book because I think it does a good job of setting the tone for at least what I wanted to accomplish with this book. There's 3 editors, there's a lot of contributors. We don't all share an agreement on what we were trying to do, and we certainly don't share an agreement on what we wrote or what we accomplished with this, but this is my picture of it. And I say, this book is different. Like the movement from whence it came, it refuses to acquiesce to our traditional notions of analysis and action. It shuns the antiquated idea that there is a single right answer to any problem. It scoffs in the face of a single set of demands. Our demand? We want everything and nothing. Our perspective? We're all a little bit right and we're all a little bit wrong. What matters is that we're doing something. That, to me, is what I wanted to try and get at with putting this book together. I wanted to create a space for people who were doing things to reflect on what they'd been doing. You know, so often it's the case that in the midst of movements, in the midst of organizing, in the midst of widespread mass social uprising and social change, which is what we've been living through for the past year and even beyond, we rarely have the time to stop and reflect and to think about what it is we're doing. Like Nadine said, Seattle was one of those moments. Seattle in '99 was one of those moments where it was like, oh, wait, what's happening? Oh my God, this is incredible. We have to jump on this. And from that came this kind of, it's more complicated than that, but the simple story is that from that came the anti-globalization movement. Similarly with Occupy, September 17th, the occupation of public space in New York. From that grows this nationwide, international movement that we're not prepared for and we don't exactly know how to deal with. But I think that one of the things I've learned over the course of the last year is that that's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It actually is a way to create space. It's a way to open up new fields of investigation, new fields of analysis, new ways of doing, new structures for building. And I think while we've used a lot of old structures and we've relied on the expertise of organizers who have been working for decades at this point, I think there are also a lot of new innovations. And I think you see some of those innovations in this book. One of the things that we tried to do was really mobilize movement connections. Mike said this at the beginning, but I'll say it again here. I don't know everyone who's in this book. Some of them I had never heard of before they sent their pieces in. Some of them were suggested to us by other friends. But I think that every piece that's in this book is incredibly valuable because it brings a unique perspective to the table in the same way that a General Assembly is valuable because it opens a space for unique perspectives to come together and for those perspectives to kind of battle it out and to kind of contest ideas, contest space, contest notions. That's something that we tried to do in this book too. So in terms of the actual organization of it, we tried to kind of group things into conversations. A lot of people are writing about similar topics. There's a lot of people in this book that are writing about the question of race. But people are writing about the question of race from different perspectives. Some folks are coming at it from the perspective of saying, you know, this movement doesn't necessarily represent the demographics of the city. But other people are coming at it from the perspective of having been folks of color working within the movement and are saying, you know, the more that we talk about Occupy as a white movement, the more we erase the participation of people of color as parts of Occupy. That's something that I wrote about specifically in my introduction. And I think there's a number of examples. It's not just race. It's gender, it's class, it's all the different things that came together, all the different questions that we had to consider over the course of the last year and that hopefully we'll continue to consider over the course of the years to come. This book is very much a jumping off point to a larger conversation. It's not a set of answers. It's not a set of prescriptions. It's an invitation to continue thinking through and continue talking about the things that we've discovered and we've learned over the past year. So I hope that you will take that invitation and continue discussing and continue talking and learning and challenging each other and challenging me too. So thank you so much for coming out tonight.